It's one of the games of all time. Hey, it's Chris. The must-have ranked board games from November 2021 through 2023. We're doing the look back. We're seeing where are things at. Are they as good as you thought? Are they as good as you remember? Are they as good as you hoped that they were going to be? Because now, at the time of me filming this, we've seen several huge projects, and they're all amazing. They're all the best games that you have ever seen in the history of the month of November, in the century of the year, right? I know that made no sense, but that's my point, is that there is always someone telling you that this game with the 37 miniatures and the ever-expanding RPG crawl, whatever it may be, triple-digit price point, is the best thing that you have ever heard. Spoilers, it's not. But you need more details than that either way. So, without further ado, let's go. So we have to start off 2021 with Rest in Peace, Monster Apocalypse. I'm sorry. No, I'm not sorry. I'm sorry in the sense that those of you who were Mythic backers and lost a collective about 1.3 million during the campaign, I'm sorry. At the same time, I don't know what to say. This is why crowdfunding is not just a pre-order. Because shortly after or before this video, I'll have the latest updates on some of the biggest-ish fails, not fails, that needed updates and spotlights on. Because, again, that's a super popular topic. Nobody likes to talk about that, so I'm going to do it anyway. Best game from 2021. Looking back at these crowdfunding projects, of all the big names, of all the big boxes, you know, it was the one with the smallest box. Nerd Lab Games freaking killed it. It gave us Mindbug. And Mindbug, as a two-player, head-to-head, card-driven, play one action a turn, your card, or attack, or flip over the Mindbug in the first place. And just beat your opponent when they only have 3 life. So, if that's not an amazing accomplishment, with this game now being ranked the 74th family game, the 260th strategy game, and under, or within, the top 400 overall, it beats out almost everything in the last 3 years, period. And that's freaking insane. In case you missed it, I've got their next one, Agent Avenue, sitting right over there. I'll tell you right now, that one's going to skyrocket up the charts. You heard it first here. Calling my shot. But it's just amazing to see everything is overpowered, nothing's overpowered, and the crazy part about this is, even though it plays in 5 minutes, the better person still will usually win. Not always, but it's just an amazing concept with what they've done of this. So, you know, going back to my intro, the cold open, right? When you see the 3, 4, 5 projects that are simultaneously going on at the time of this airing, Avalon the Riven Vale. Oh, it's the best area control game ever. Oh, we have Lands of Evershade. It's the best, dungeon crawl RPG campaign progression game ever. Or Vestige. It's one of the best Euro, more modern Vindication 2.0 games. Whatever it may be, folks, this is perhaps the most well-received game on crowdfunding, living up to potential across the board, not just niche within a niche within a niche, compared to all the other ones that were similar size, scope, and shape. Again, that's not saying that you can't love those too, but perspective. This is the stuff that's easy to overlook. And let's go to the second one, because I'm going to prove my point here, right? Weather Machine. Fantastic game, right? It's 658th at this point. And you're going, Chris, Weather Machine, isn't that, that's an Eagle Griffin Lacerda game. And I'm not going to be able to tell you the mechanical breakdown of that. But the most interesting aspect of this is the worst rated of these in the past, 5 years. And that's, setting the bar pretty high to begin with. That's setting the standard very high. But it's also one of those ones that I don't hear anybody talking about, right? And that's not just me saying that, right? Comparatively, I came with my stats loaded on this one. Kanban, 45th overall. On Mars, 51st. Lisboa, 58. Galar, 71. Then you're getting down even a little bit further. Your Rococo's sitting at 307. And then Escape Plan, 576. So it's, lower than almost all of those other ones. So why is this one just kind of meh? And again, now the price with a little bit of inflation, you're running 120, 130. If you want to get it early, you can get $200 worth of this. as Eagle Griffin will fly it over, you know, airship it to you. Oh my goodness gracious, you people and your stupid deluxeifications. That is a deluxeification well worth paying for. Nope. So that's just the question mark. What differentiates this from any of those other ones? And why isn't this one as well received? Because, I mean, it's received. It's one of the games of all time, as they say. But that moves us on to sort of the only other game that is even near the top 1,000, and this was more of an expansion for it as well, the Call to Adventure, tile-chucking, character-building game, which tried to have thematic incorporation, but just also was more of abstracty regardless of how well you wanted to incorporate your character, because you kind of just did what was best for the game, and it didn't really always make sense for the character. And it had an expansion that came out in 2021, and so that's why we're talking about it. But the base game is, I mean, it's 1,009 at the time of me filming this. So it's just, you know, a recipient, a elevation from sheer volume. 7.1 rating, 6,500 ratings total. And we'll get to a couple of the others here at the tail end of 2021 that are suffering both in several ways from the lack thereof ratings, because the next three games actually all are in within about 50 spots of each other in the 2,400s. And, you know, we're getting Resurgence, which is sitting just under 2,400. The Stan Kordonsky, you know, classic Euro game where you're sort of hiding your workers, bidding and bluffing them out to go to locations, and just done in a kind of clever Euro way. And they just got like a little bit of a retheme. I really actually enjoyed the bag building worker placement of this, but it also kind of fell in the realm of the middling Euros. Like, it wasn't doing anything like, whoa! It didn't have to, but it also just, you know, when I think of these games and what I really enjoy, it didn't do anything to really excite me. And I'd say the 2,400 is probably fair. Although, you know, again, like, putting this in perspective, 2,400 is still really, really freaking good. It says it's a 3-weight on Board Game Geek. I'd argue that I didn't have much trouble with it whatsoever. So maybe I'm just getting better at these games, or maybe it's not quite as heavy. So from Half a Kingdom, it's definitely a dark horse as a game you should really give a look-see. But, I mean, that's probably the biggest thing, is in the sea of the Euros, is it going to be appealing? And maybe that, going back to Weather Machine, is just the problem, right? In the sea of Lacerdas, it's going to fall similarly, just not at the top. And then the next one, actually, you know, 6.8 rating, somehow, again, puts it about 2,400 as well, right behind Resurgence at Hamlet the Village Building game, right? And, you know, Dave was super nice when I screwed up the rules on my video, and they didn't totally crucify me. So I give them a lot of, you know, thank yous. But it's one of those where it's got a lot of ratings. It's got 2,100 ratings at 6.8 even. It still puts them somehow in the 2,400s, which consequently Resurgence has 7.7 rating, but it has less than a third of those ratings as a whole. So, you know, you're sitting very similarly. And consequently, same thing with Elder Scrolls, which is the next one, the Skyrim Medifus style. The aspect of that game being more like a Ameritrash rather than Chip Theories being a little bit more Euro economy campaign based. But going back to Hamlet, again, I think there was a huge swell. This was one of the ones, you know, 3 years ago that was like, hey, look at this huge cardboard, you know, chapel that we can put, kind of like the Everdell tree. And it just didn't deliver ultimately gameplay that was like as interesting, mechanically speaking, from a pick up and deliver style of things as people were hoping. The criticalness of some of the money and the workers in terms of those movements across the board. A lot of people are like, okay, well, let's see what their expansion adds, but it hasn't gone up significantly from that standpoint. So it's kind of, you know, just, again, out there as in this realm. Then going back to Elder Scrolls, like I said, right, Skyrim, Medifus, the Ameritrash version, and it just suffers from lack of exposure. As the, you know, open world campaign-ish goes, I think it was fine. I think it's significantly more expensive. There were something like, I don't know, like 11 or 14,000 people that backed this on crowdfunding, which again goes to show you how few people rate things on Board Game Geek, which ultimately leads to significant skewing. I don't even rate my favorite games because I think the Board Game Geek algorithm is just completely screwed up in the first place. Those videos on a monthly basis continue to emphasize that to me. And it's expensive. It's a little bit more complex. You can get your expansions, you can get your miniatures, but I don't, again, see the real appeal beyond being a hardcore Skyrimmer as the one comparatively, right, to any of these other dozen to 24 games that have come out since with similar vibes, questing, campaign, upgradable characters, tech trees, ability upgrades, whatever you want. This one is, again, stuck in the middling sea of things, doing okay, not poor, but also in the realm of riches that we currently live in, crowdfunding and retail, both. It's kind of like, well, if it wasn't attached to this name, would you be as attached to the actual gameplay? And that's the big question mark. And I would say that people, again, just don't really rate it. So who knows? Then the one that I will say that I feel like suffers from the sheer lack of ratings, or maybe this is just the sheer lack of exposure to expose it, currently crowdfunding at the time of me filming this as well, is their latest game, Sweetlands from Achiba Koya. And this is Ostia, 1 to 4 player, Mancala resource system where you're going around and placing your little ship pieces, and the last spot you land in activates your action selection resource management style Euro elements. I would say that this is probably the most underrated game of the last 2 or 3 years when we're looking at these November games. It sits at 4,200, 7.7, but again, 380 ratings. You pay a premium for these Japanese games, Achiba Koyas aren't available widely on the secondary market. It's the Japanese thing where they use cubes for everything, which frankly speaking is a little bit refreshing at times when everything feels like it's just a sheer overload. And it's probably not cost efficient value-wise, but it still must be loved because when the expansion came around earlier in 2024, people again threw money at it without any hesitation. So this one, I dare say, more exposure, I think more love. But if the Mancala system, similarly to the recently funded Druid City Games' Madkala, isn't up your style or your preferred play preference, I would argue that this one is going to fall completely and utterly flat. But as many games that do not use this, we do not see it across the board, it might be worth a look-see just if you're looking for something that is a little more different than a lot of the other stuff out there to give you a sense of, okay, is different good or bad for me in this one. Then, Starfighters Rapid Fire. I thought Star Fox, the board game, had hit written all over it. Alley Cat Games, crowdfunding. There's only 94 ratings right now at the time of me filming this. 13,000, 6.6. And yeah, it's a 6 game for me too. I just didn't like what it was doing. Just too scattered in terms of how you were trying to accomplish things. The ship maneuvering on the hex-based grid left me okay-ish, but it was really hard to maneuver. You had to allocate your dice, and you didn't have enough dice to allocate and not reallocate some of the other ones. And the dice rolling was fine in the real-time element, but it just felt disjointed. The asymmetry wasn't enough between the ships, and the mechanisms just didn't interlock the way they should have. So, yeah, that is 2021. Then we move on to 2022. And 2022 was much more prolific. We've seen a lot of these really rise up and rise up meteorically, speaking in terms of rankings, desire, hot lists, wish list, whatever it may be so far in 2024, because, we're at about the 2-year cycle of things on crowdfunding. Let's be honest, if you're getting it under a year, as you'll see in the 2023s, it is more the exception rather than the rule, because everybody wants their free loan and they want it sooner. So what is the best of 2022? Arguably one of the best games of the year. This year, arguably probably going to be one of the best games of all time. And that's what we do, right? We put every moniker and label like that. At least 3 times a year, you'll hear that the game of the year is the game of the year, right? Slay the freaking Spire. I have it in my cart. I got screwed. I went to Boardlandia. I was going to buy it on Boardlandia, and then someone posted on Board Game Geek about Boardlandia's sale, and then it was out of my cart before I knew it. So I will maybe have it before the end of the year. It's sitting 199th right now. One of the fastest meteoric rises we have seen with the endorsement of practically the entire community across the board. I'd make the argument, though, that I just don't know, right? Personally speaking, my biggest hesitation has always been, is it going to be for me as a non-solo player? You can do the multiplayer. Is it just multiplayer solitaire, or is there going to be more interaction as an originally solo-based game? I'm eating crow in the sense that I wasn't sure it was going to pan out at all. I love the fact that the only deluxifications were non-gameplay, opposite of what Dead Cells offered and had gameplay inclusion. So, not sure if Dead Cells is going to be worth picking up at retail or waiting for a reprint. The only surprising thing, or the biggest surprise of this, is that we haven't heard news of more, right? A reprint or more content, because this is just ripe for more, potentially, if you can get a license to have some creativity or incorporate whatever else you couldn't include the first time around. And if you're not familiar with Slay the Spire in general, I mean, just go buy it on Steam or Nintendo Switch, or wherever your preferred platform is. Basically, it's, you know, build your deck of cards, buy them as you're climbing the tower doing battles, play them, defeat enemies, rinse and repeat. When you die, keep some of your stuff for unlocks next time around, giving you multiple player characters that with asymmetric powers, abilities, cards, however you want to customize it as you go along. Now, just instead of, like I said, solo, you can do it cooperatively as a whole. So I will probably have a copy for the end of the year, because I'm probably about now 70-30 in terms of getting it because I actually think it's going to be good and it's going to be a good freaking fit for me, rather than previously in the year when I was doing it more 30-70, 30% that I thought was going to be a good fit and 70% that I'm doing it for the clicks, right? Because there's a huge element of that on this side of things, in case you weren't aware. But then the second best game was actually Oceans, because Oceans came back with the Legend of the Deep expansion in 2022, and they expounded on what was now the 557th best rated game over all time, 363 strategy wise, as you go from the shallows into the deep, as you're customizing, evolving, creating your species, trying to feed them all at the same time, and really getting into the cool stuff with Legends of the Deep, with giving you the legendary cards, legend, wait for it, dairy, and then getting you a little bit more of just the deep asymmetric cards as a whole, whereas is really where the cool stuff is in the first place. This gave you more of a good thing, and I don't think it turned anybody off. It's just whether or not you wanted to deluxify it with the little tokens of the fish being slightly blinged out more so than, well, Johnny come lately down the road, your neighbor. So I don't think it's doing anything dramatically different. Honestly, I just love the deep cards. But it was one of those games where I didn't want to wait to get to the really cool part for me. And so I ended up actually trading it away, but it's a solid game. It has 7,000 ratings on Board Game Geek, so that's relatively impressive. Even though, you know, comparatively, I should say Slay the Spire has nearly 4,000 at the time of me filming this. So the fact that it's already out for like less than a year and it's got that many ratings compared to a game of Oceans, which has been out for now nearly 4 years, having half, that's impressive. Then Role Player Adventures got an expansion in addition, and this is probably arguably one of the games that I would recommend as an easiest intro into campaign linking legacy style games in the first place, using the role player system that Thunderworks developed as sort of your D&D meets dice rolling, dice mitigation, and skill checks. And I really like this game. It's not for everybody. It's another big box, but it's probably the easiest, most accessible one of these types in the first place. It's one that's going to pair very well with family, but it's going to have enough allocation and mitigation and, you know, a little bit of tactical skill in order to make you feel like if you're a heavier gamer, this still might have some aspect for you, using, again, the similar system that Role Player did and mastered and people loved in the first place after, you know, the base game and 2 expansions. So this offered more content, more of the same, and this is sitting under the top 1,000. It's sitting in the 800s right now and 110 thematic, so people really like what it's bringing, even though there can always be a little bit of that disconnect with a dice rolling skill check style system. Yeah, right? Choose your side, choose your poison, choose your faction, and go with Thunderworks here. And so no surprise that it's well received when you've got more accessibility, because I mean that is the commonality with a lot of these games in the top 1,000, say what you will. Then the other meteoric rise so far, with only a couple months under its belt right now, is Unconscious Mind, as arguably one of the, if not the Euro game worker placement of 2024 at the time of me filming this. There will be a lot of debate about that. There's a couple other ones up for consideration, Civolution, Menifer, that are sort of sliding in right now, but I would make argument that this is the front runner, and it's already sitting in the 1100th at the time of me filming this. I got a chance to preview it from Fantasia Games when it was on crowdfunding. There was one element that I felt a little bit disconnected on, the 2 separate boards, but ultimately, again, I'm not a great, super good judge of that, but I did not feel, comparatively to some of the other heavier weight games, even like the more recent Luthier from Paverson Games, that this was as heavy as its numbers represent, with a 3.9 rating on Board Game Geek. So I'd say this one is a little bit more accessible. I feel like this one is a little bit less needing to get in overhead wise, and it's more decision make spacing on the game board itself. The rules were a lot easier to learn than, say, a Paverson or a Voidfall along those lines, if you're looking for somewhat of a very poor man's comparison. 1 to 2 hours, It has the beautiful aesthetic. The question I think that is still being raised with a lot of these games is how much aesthetic or crowdfunding inflation does a game like this have? Or is it really truly that good? And when we have these first early months surrounding and just past the delivery date, there's still a lot of nebulous there with this. But I think, just given the overwhelming rise across the board, I'd say it's probably more stay power than not at this aspect. So then we get into Fit to Print, which was Flat Out Games' offering this time of the year 2 years ago as the tile-laying real-time situation of making your own front page of the newspaper with various tiles of shapes, colors, sizes, and icons, and having a limited amount of time to do it over 3 rounds with varying size of the page as you go along. Simultaneous play with a slight asymmetric mini expansion to give you just one little power to mitigate things. Really plays fast, really plays chaotically, and personally speaking, it was not a good fit. Even though I love tiling, even though they're real time, it just didn't give me the controlled chaos that I prefer. And I don't think that that is probably unique. I would also say though that that's probably more the exception than the rule, because 7.4 and sitting in the 1200s as well as the top, like 325 board games for Flat Out Games, and overall it's not the consensus by any means. I will say at the same time, comparatively, and again, not just me speaking, but the stats speaking for themselves again, other Flat Out Games considerations: Cascadia 48, Calico 249, Verdant 735, even Point City sitting at 1194, and then we get to Fit to Print. Nocturne is the more recent one, which I'd make the argument I like maybe Nocturne slightly more than Fit to Print, but I'd say both of those equally are a notch below the other ones that I listed there at the top with Verdant, Calico, and Cascadia. So the ranking comparison there in the Flat Out 30 minutes, $30 price range, price size games are probably true as well. Then we go on to a completely different blinged out massive version of a game that just got a huge crowd swell boost of a ton of money, of a couple $1 million over on GameFound within the last 2 months, and that was Heroes of Might and Magic 3 from Archon Studios. I have no nostalgia for the video game, but a lot of people do, and if this wasn't good the first time around, although people say the rules are atrocious and you shouldn't learn them, you should probably go find the Board Game Geek errata redo version that people inevitably do and somehow companies can't manage to do themselves, which is a whole nother issue besides not having rulebooks out during campaigns. Heroes of Might and Magic, for what it is, people are really enjoying it. Now, again, I wonder how much IP entanglement there is with a rating of 8.0 and 1,700 ratings at the time of me filming this. But just like with Ostia, if people really didn't like it, despite the small or large number of ratings, they wouldn't necessarily, hopefully, be throwing Godzook's amount of cash at it again as it comes around the second time. And inarguably, it raised even more money the second time around than the first time, which speaks to people enjoying when they can actually slog through and get it to those aspects. And now this is going to be a little bit more of an adventure-driven strategy game. You're setting up one of your factions as you're going through hexagonal fields with sort of an overworld explorative upgrading situation combined with the overarching and then diving down into the battle side of things on a separate board. The big debate or the big conversation around a game like this, similar to say Spire, but is sometimes the more where do things go, is that as a video game previously ported now over to the tabletop, how much of the upkeep do you feel like you want to do? How much of the upkeep do you feel like you need to do? And how do you express that into a rulebook, right? 50 or 60 page rulebooks are becoming more of par for the course, especially with these types of adventure crawl-ish games. And how much is the actual asymmetric version or faction delineation when you've got something like 8 now with the base game and several others offered with the second crowdfunding time around? The incorporation of those themes and those elements, especially if you were a fan, seemed to be the biggest hit with this game. But similarly, if you didn't have a tie into it, some of that slog in order to actually get it to the table is by far the biggest barrier in our hobby as a whole. And so that is one of the biggest turnoffs that people are saying as well with this game. Going a slightly different direction, we're going about the 2600s now with Maple Valley. So we've got a little bit more in that same 2000s range. And this was the offering from Kids Table Board Games when it came to crowdfunding in 2022. As sort of a multi-resource management, mitigatable, move your character around the map and the seasons and gather, gather, and gather, essentially, was this game in a nutshell. Between the base game and the expansion, there were something along the lines of 13 different resources that you were having to try to manage while recruiting more campers and people to, well, get your resources in the first place. Gathering your badges, exploring the asymmetric objectives with a little bit of worker build as you go along. That was the key gist, because you're going to be moving them along the paths, gathering from where they can gather with a slight asymmetric setup of what tokens, what resources are going to be where along the board. Overall lighter, but thought to be, or comparatively, a slight upgrade in terms of complexity to their previous offering of creature comforts, still with the same aesthetic, in the same sort of setting or world. You don't really compete over places, so that may be a plus or a minus. The card displays aren't always the best. There's a little bit of lack of ability to rotate that to some of your choosing. So, it's a family-friendly game with a lot of resource management in a, light-ish Euro style. Then, as we start to get to the end of 2022, we go back to Gamelin Games with their latest offering in the Tiny Epic series, which, again, very debatable with these situations. And what I worry about, or what we have seen, is the high variability in which the tiny and the epic portions can be accomplished together. And Crimes here kind of encapsulates that, as you have 48 hours to investigate the crime that has occurred. Because the variability in which one of these is good and one of these isn't quite as good, there doesn't seem to be as much rhyme or reason, as they just try to encapsulate Gamelin Games in the Tiny Epic series with every sort of thematic incorporation that they can and every sort of mechanistic approach that they can, and smash them together and see kind of what happens, sort of like a Mad Lib situation. And this is not one of the best ones received so far. Arguably, sitting at about 6,000 at the time of me filming this, it's one of the worst ones received comparatively. You still have your Galaxies, which is thought of as the best, and then Dungeons, and then it kind of drops off down to Dinosaurs, Quest, Zombies, and Kingdoms, followed by Pirates and Westerns. But even Mechs and Vikings, which are slightly more scattered offerings as well, are still sitting in the 2,700s. So time will tell if Crime is really going to pay, but so far it hasn't. It's got a Clue vibe with going around trying to solve the forensics, the murder weapon, or the getaway vehicle, all while using your secret decoder style ring in order to figure it out. You may have to have more than one juggling investigation going on while you're doing it before you get to pin the murder on who you think did it before the end. Does it sound good from a whodunit? Arguably, though, is there a better one out there that does it, that doesn't have to be crammed all in a small box or a small rule size? Because sometimes constraining yourself in that way, it shows the flaws sometimes more than it actually helps streamline things. Then the sleeper hit for me of 2022, I'm waiting to get my copy from Brother Ming Games, React, The Art of War. Sort of takes an acrylic standee vibe on head-to-head asymmetric battling. What Senjutsu should have been, what Senjutsu failed to accomplish with the 3D grid of the combat style in the lines of your Exceeds and your Yomis and your Battlecons, where Senjutsu was a lot of swinging and missing. This is a lot of manipulation, cleverness, and tactical gameplay with a hint smidge of strategy. Very small, constrained abilities that you get to rinse and repeat and master and get a meta style of as you try and knock out your opponent. Again, it's going to be too early to tell, but this was really a game I enjoyed, and Ming does a great job putting out these solid products. It is being delivered at the time of me filming this, so again, you'll probably hear about it in the next couple months. Again, don't listen to me on how I think it is. Go check out Before You Play, who I think also loved it. So, right? Size equals might. So there you go. And then the last up offering from 2022, we're, kind of just waiting and seeing. Steamforge and Elden Ring, right? The price of a PS5 plus the cost of the game on PS5 in the first place gets you part of the game at some point down the line here. Details are sparse. Gameplay is kind of not really known at this time. Sort of a spin-off of the previous iterations with Horizon and Dark Souls. Can you improve? Will we continue to see that from them in the first place? The question I'd worry about at this point is just having seen the recently completed campaign of Bardsung 2.0. When this inevitably comes around for further parts of the game in the future after this is delivered in, 2026. Just joking, I don't have a clue. But I'm not sure they're anywhere close to production either. So you'll probably have it about this time next year in 2025 if you're lucky. What improvements are going to potentially come as it comes out further? So that'd be my only question. And with something like this, if you spent that much money on it, How do you feel about having that much tied up with all of the other iterations of games like this that have come out subsequently? Now, moving on to 2023, only 2 of these have delivered, but there's a lot of high name, high profile, high risk, high reward projects that are going to be very interesting to see how they follow up on their predecessors' heels. The 2 that have delivered, one is making waves, ooh, dad pun there, and then the other one is sort of flying under the radar as one of my own personal crowd favorite picks. First up, we have Kelp, which is, Shark versus Octopus, 2-player asymmetry, as one person takes the tiles and the dominoes of the Octopus, and then the shark, little Lego style, is going around trying to find and eat the Octopus in order to win the game. Octopus just has to outlast, and not get eaten in the first place. 7.9, people are well received as a light style 2-player asymmetric game, sitting at 3,000 at the time of me filming this, which arguably within the last month of delivering, still very, very freaking good, and already in the 600s for thematic incorporation. There is some concern, as the main criticism being that the shark doesn't seem to have as much decision making, and that the best move is obvious, but sometimes the best move being obvious is still and can still be fun. So how much does it have to be asymmetric wise with a game that will play in under an hour with these aspects? 2 little expansions to go along with it to give it some more depth and breadth, but is it going to be too light for you? Or again, will this be a game that we'll be talking about a year from now in this line of style of game? Then the only other one that delivered so far is one of my favorite companies. Again, I'm a simp, I'm biased for this. Level 99 Games, one of my favorite games of all time. Bullet, with their 2 new latest expansions, Paw and Palette, for feline characters and just more females who are shooting guns at each other in a real-time bullet blasting, asymmetric, meta-ish. Can you clear your board and send them to your opponent before they knock you out, before you get knocked out, or before you draw the wrong things out of your bag, right? It's got solo, it's got competitive, it's got cooperative against a boss. Choose your ilk. The biggest downside of this one was there wasn't a huge incentive, apart from like some foils, to get it on crowdfunding. And if you wanted to support them at retail, or you just want to pick up it at retail, it is now widely available. And the biggest problem with each of these having 4 new heroines is that you're just not going to use them because you have too much bullet content like I do, because you've already found your favorites and you probably don't need any more. And again, ratings of expansions are going to be not very helpful, but Bullet, the base game at the time of me filming this, is in the top 700s, rated at 690 and 158 family overall. I'd argue that, is this another conundrum that we saw once or twice last month with Bullet Star being another standalone base game, which is getting separate ratings comparatively, which is also sitting at 1900. So if both of these were actually combined, would you actually have a situation where Bullet Heart in the first place could actually be much higher, because Bullet Star has an 8 rating average, as Bullet's 7.6 kind of could be boosted there even further to easily be in the top 500 as a whole. So those are the 2 that are funded and received at the time of me filming this. Then we start to get in the huge names, huge price points, and huge question marks. First up, very, very straightforward, Food Chain Magnate, right? This is easily one of the best heavy games of all time from Splatter. And you know what you're getting with this one when Lucky Duck came back around and they said, hey, we're going to give it the aesthetic upgrade that people have been complaining about for years. As you want to build your, restaurant, and you want to be very cutthroat in your resource management and worker placement. And you can even catch up with the expansion that's going to be offered with their GameFound campaign. You can deluxify and bling it out to all hell and make it look better, Ron Burgundy. And that was the big conundrum. It is blinged out, it's colorified, it's made everything bigger and better though. And that's going to be the divisive element. The mechanics of this are not in question. No one is arguing that. There really were no changes from those aspects. But did it need this? Did it need the aesthetic upgrade? Purists are going to say no. People who want more thematic bling on their ring are going to say yes. But is it worth the same price blinged out? Is it worth a price and a half almost, if you include the expansion, to make it that much plastified? Because that's going to be the question mark with this one ultimately. The weird thing about this was when I'm looking at the pledge levels at the time of me filming this, the base pledge was $175, which gets you the special edition with all the deluxified. The deluxe base game and expansion was only $197, so like $20 more. But that's still not the collector's pledge, which was $330, which offered you every blinged out thing you can think of, even though that plastic still looks kind of bad to me, frankly speaking. And I hope that's just the renderings of the images that they did. And again, it raised tons of money for a game that people always clamored that they wanted, but never were willing to shell out the bucks for Slaughter to pick it up in the first place, with over $2.1 million raised post-campaign. The problem is, right before I filmed this, they just released final production miniatures, so they're all gray and it's closing time. So you're probably going to have it sometime in mid-2025. And we'll see what the reaction is and whether it's going to be resold or it is resellable or what happens along those lines. Then we go up to the next one, the biggest make it or break it, one of the biggest funders of 2023 period, one of the biggest funders ever, in probably the top 10 or 15 overall, the third in the Nemesis trilogy, Nemesis Retaliation. If you didn't have enough slog, shoot 'em up, and crawl aspects in the first two, this one was the one for you. The highly anticipated third installment of the critically acclaimed. No, seriously, that's what it says over on Board Game Geek in its description from the designers. So you're getting the third time around Marines entering an alien nest and trying to wipe them out. Less hidden movement, less, deduction in those elements. More blast 'em, shoot 'em, take 'em out style. People loved what they see. And I'd make the argument that, right, this ain't going to be the last time you see Nemesis. Because if you're making that much bling, people are going to go back to what makes money. And I always give kudos to Awakened Realms. They separate out the miniatures. But you can be, again, spending $300 for a game like this. And the big question mark was, when people talk about the first two, nobody talks about the essential expansions. Inevitably, millions of dollars are spent on expansions with these campaigns. And so, why? You can see the track record, right? The track record of the base game is super good. Base game originally, Nemesis, 21 ranked overall. Lockdown, 135 ranked overall. Both in the top 30 thematically incorporated games. Fantastic. But again, the rules are getting more complex. The streamlinedness is kind of getting away from some of the other stuff we've seen. And arguably, again, I have to put it out there, if this wasn't Alien the board game, would you be as enamored with the actual mechanics? A lot of these shoot 'em up stealth-ish type games we've now seen 3 or 4 of in the last couple of years. I think the pedigree is absolutely fantastic. I think the price point is also super high, just like with the bar that you expect the quality of the overall gameplay to be. But it's also the conundrum of, is more more? And inarguably, and again, I would make the argument that on crowdfunding, people seem to think more equals more equals better. And this one doesn't stray too far from that. And I'd argue that at the same time, this one will be in the top, 100 as well in 2 years' time after it's released. But is it going to be in the top 200, if you know what I mean? How much inflation goes along with this one? And it's always very interesting to see how Awakened Realms does their pre-post campaign situation. Not all of the pages on GameFound, when you click on them post-campaign, show you how much they've raised total in the Pledge Manager, but the Awakened Realms ones always manage to highlight that, because post-campaign, the total amount of funding was nearly $19 million. During the campaign, it was $12 million. So again, a lot of that money being thrown at stuff that will invariably never hit the table. So again, just because you're getting a value doesn't mean it's a value. So we'll see where these expansions add up. And I guess I would wonder how much of that $12 to $18 million was people getting in on the previous stuff that they missed out on accordingly in the past. The problem with this campaign, the biggest problem, is that when this launched, they said, you know what, we're going to split this into 2 waves. If you want some of the old stuff, we'll ship that to you in the first wave. If you want all the new stuff, if you want Retaliation, you can get that in the second wave. The first wave hasn't even really shipped yet, and that was supposed to be, well, before now. And so the Retaliation, consequently, was supposed to be April 2025. If you have Retaliation in your hands at the time of me filming this next year and doing this, you'll be lucky. And so, again, value-wise, I'm not going to make the argument. Production-wise, aesthetic-wise, I'm not going to make that argument. The core pledge of this, getting the stretch goals for $65 is absolutely fantastic, especially with just the non-miniature version. $109, again, you'll save money comparatively if you pick up that in the stretch goals. But arguably, with Knockdown sitting right here behind Summoner Wars, the amount of money I spent on that nowadays, comparatively to what it goes for at retail, is not as significantly different as when Nemesis came around in the first place. So I think that's the big question mark with things like Awakened Realms and even more of the more recent ones along the lines of the currently funding Lands of Evershade. what is that price difference going to look like? Because it's not as big anymore as it was previously when they first started running into these. And how much is that going to affect things down the line? Money-wise, not a whole lot. FOMO-wise, absolutely. The other one, huge amounts of money, millions of dollars on crowdfunding, was Perseverance. Mindclash went back to Perseverance and they said episodes 3 and 4. Episodes 3 and 4 that we can say, okay, 1 and 2 are good. We're going to link a heavy Euro worker placement game and have you be able to span 4 different 3-hour games in order to get an encapsulating full experience. And so 3 and 4 in your living dinosaur world with an evolving strategy game to give you slight differences and nuances between all of these, mechanically speaking. I can't speak to those. This is way too heavy in the Mindclash world for me to look at. But as the 1300th ranked game overall, when the first episodes 1 and 2 came out, are your hopes in line with this being a continuation? Or similarly to, say, as we just were talking about with Nemesis, are you really going to just find 1 or 2 of these, even 1 or 2 of these that aren't together, like 2 and 4 or 1 and 3, that are really going to be a better mechanical fit to you with the nuances and the differences? And that's the scary thing with this. Although you're getting a 2-in-1 situation for the price of, say, a weather machine that we talked about at the beginning of the video with about $130, what if one of those 2 just isn't for you, right? We talk about it all the time with the small box campaigns, with the all plays or the bite wings, where they've got, okay, buy more to save more, get 3 games or get 4 games or get 2 games and you'll save a bunch of money. Well, here's your scenario where you may end up with one game that just doesn't really fit and you can't really buy them, well, at all really in a good way separately. Does that feel good when you're buying more to find out that one of them isn't what you want? I mean, that's the criticism against a lot of the asymmetric games, even like Root or Dice Throne, or even something like Summoner Wars, where you buy it and you find out that a couple of those factions aren't for you and you just bought them all and you're kind of SOL because you ended up paying probably a little bit more of a premium to get more of them in the first place, because now everything has to be, 16 different things in one box and have 3 times the price rather than, the starter sets. And that's where I give Dice Throne a little kudos of separating those out into the 2-player ones so that you can get a little bit more of finding which one is right for you without having to get the overhead. Are you willing to do that with a heavier worker placement style, though, from Perseverance? And consequently, going over to the page, the updates say that, well, they're closing the pledge manager at about the time this will be airing, shortly after I'm filming it. And then the timeline for the rest of the production and arrival was supposed to be originally July 2025. They're looking off about 4 or 5 months. And by this time next year, you will probably have your copy if you're, staying on timetable with what's listed right now, even though, again, they're estimating August to September. If you're like me, right, with the CMOD Marvel United Multiverse, somehow East Coast USA is like 6 months behind the rest of the world. But that can change things a little bit. But again, still not terribly far off. And I like seeing the better estimations. Although, again, my main criticism on a lot of these campaigns is come to crowdfunding later so that you're not having to project 2 years out in the first place for my free loan. Then the only other game that had some portion of things delivered similarly to the ones we've mentioned is Ahoy from Leader Games. They came out with a new Horizons expansion. Ahoy reminds me a little bit of the Black Angel situation. Because when Black Angel came out, it was, okay, it's going to be huge, it's going to be hype, it's going to be like Trey's, it's only going to be better, it's the second iteration, it's going to be even better than what is one of the top couple hundred games of all time. And it wasn't as the same as people wanted it to be. It wasn't the same mechanically, but that was the head-to-head comparison that people always made, and then it was deemed inferior because it didn't live up to the expectations that were probably not set correctly in the first place. And I would make that argument very much so with Ahoy, that people were like, okay, this is going to be Root 2.0, it's going to be Root more accessible, it's going to be, and then it wasn't quite that way because it wasn't designed to be that way, and then it got kind of let down and it had this huge big swell after Gen Con, and then it kind of died out and you don't hear about it anymore. It's got a 7.3 rating with 2,000 ratings on Board Game Geek, but it's sitting at 1,600, which is still freaking amazing. And then they came out with New Horizons expansion with more swashbucklers and soldiers and 4 new factions to aid in your asymmetry. The big problem that I had, or my big criticism when the crowdfunding campaign went, was that it really wasn't offering more for like the lower player count dynamics, where you were still playing with like some of the same ones every single time, and it was more like variability when you played with 3 or 4 to give more options at those player counts, which optimally speaking with this and Root probably is the best way to play it at all. But if you were looking for more of that at a slightly lower player count, again, this probably wasn't a good fit in the first place, and it didn't really do anything to change your mind in that aspect. But arguably, I'd say that this one is still probably another dark horse that is overachieving, even though it's underachieving at the same time with the comparisons I made earlier. I mean, the big blessing or curse with this one is that because it's a leader game, because it's a Cole Whirly, you're getting a lot of post-campaign playtesting, which again, plus or minus, is a good thing. One, again, I wish you'd come earlier with a lot of this playtesting. Two, I love the fact that you're still playtesting so that the final product will be that much better. Three, it's not going to be out anytime in the near future. You're probably looking at mid-2025 if you're lucky at this point, because they're still working on production. So just kind of wait and see. Then quickly, my dark horse of the year, last year at the end of the year, I think this one has a real chance to be one of the top games of my preferred preference going into 2025, and that's Singularity or Singularity.exe. Sort of, again, a head-to-head asymmetric battler where you take 3 of your heroes, you can rotate them in and out of the line of damage of who's taking damage and who's not, because you're going to have 5 overall on your battle line. You're going to be comboing with a little bit of, not really construction, but rotating systems of what's going to be available as the cards pop up and rotate through each individual character, and the first person to knock out 3 on the other side wins. I think this one is doing tremendous things. I really think it fits a niche that isn't being occupied by the other 2-player asymmetric battlers, and it was really one of my favorite games that I played on a crowdfunding prototype preview version from 2023. And similarly, actually both Ahoy with the new expansion as well as Singularity raised about $250,000. So both actually freaking fantastic amounts of money given the selective niche of both of these games. Singularity, unfortunately, was supposed to be delivered about this time, year out. As a new company, Octothorpe, though, we're looking probably more, again, Q2 of 2025. They're working on production, and so the artwork looks fantastic. Again, about 6 months overdue, not completely unexpected at all, especially from a new company. So we'll see where this one ends up next year. Then we move on to a much larger project, and this was the latest in the Zombicides. On the heels of being delivered in terms of the Marvel iteration, we have DCeased, which launched from CMON with the DC version of things. Again, raising only $2.5 million, comparatively DC United as well as DCeased, just showing DC is clearly not as popular of a property comparatively to what the Marvel compatriot is in the first place. However, at the same time, showing us that people are still willing to chuck money at dice chuckers, really, essentially. And so I give kudos to CMON because, again, similarly to the Marvel IP, they reached deep into the pocketbooks in terms of the lore and the characters and just the coolness of what they're potentially offering. But the big question mark, again, with this one, even though it raised $2.5 million, what difference is this actually going to be than Marvel, right? What other nuance, what other mechanic? Why, if I have a Zombicide game at all, and I think this is the other fear I have with this iteration of the Zombicide, and maybe why we haven't seen as much more recently since then, because we still have kind of 2 outstanding Zombicide games at this point, is what is the incentive to get in now? What is the incentive to get this one over a different one? Again, you do not have IP affiliation in the first place. No amount of this is another Zombicide is going to change your mind, even with all the exclusivity that they offer and the resale value and the money you can make doing that, right? Like, that's a lot of money to have tied up for an unknown. And if it's not going to be any better, if it's going to be very similar to the other ilks of the heavy Euros, as you were talking about with Weather Machine, of how do you differentiate the heavy Resurgence, how do you differentiate the Zombicides, and is this one really going to be that much different if you don't care about the theme? And the truth of it is, well, one, it's too hard to tell sometimes with these, and with the expansions that come with a lot of these, just similar to the United Corporation line of things that we see now, you can't on surface value. So you're question marking a lot of these and not knowing until you get them on the secondary market. So again, $2.5 million is fantastic comparatively to other Zombicides or even the Marvel one, which is, again, the exception rather than the rule. I'm not sure it's quite as good overall. Now, this one was actually supposed to be delivered in April 2025, and the white production copies, the white samples, were back in June. So if this stays on track, I mean, June next year may not actually be too far off in that realm of the second quarter. So this one might be right around on-time projection if it stays true. We'll see. I mean, it's got a licensed IP, so anything can happen with that in terms of production, in terms of QA, in terms of quality projections, like we're seeing with Marvel Dice Throne X-Men. That delayed that significantly, so I wouldn't be surprised either way if that's a few months later even projected at this point. 2 more here at the end. One, going back to Steamforged, raised over £1 million on Kickstarter when it funded. You have a dive back into the Horizon series of Forbidden West, Seeds of Rebellion. Again, sort of similar to the Monster Hunter situation, is the second time iteration, just like I mentioned earlier in the video with Bardsong, going to be the case and point with this one as well. A new canon story, more cooperative gameplay, deck building, intelligent combat, and equipment crafting, giving you both campaign modes as well as one-shot modes. Is it going to be better though? There wasn't as much dynamic experience. There was a lot more grindiness. There was a lot less decision making that people didn't feel really encapsulated the video game in the first place with this. And similarly, like we were talking about earlier, can you actually incorporate a video game that has all the dynamics and make it work on a tabletop without having just too much? And that's the big question mark and unknown with this one, because again, you can be spending upwards of £300 at the time of pledging to get this for a May 2025 potential delivery date, which is probably at this point going to be completely off, and you'll be lucky if you have anything before the end of 2025, because the latest update actually has them still tooling the molds for the miniatures, and these are some big miniatures and lots of miniatures. So I would say easily going to be 6 months overdue, if not much more. Then last up, we're actually going to more of a roll and write that went over on Backer Kit last year. Moonrollers, the roll and write version of Moonrakers from Ivy Studios that they blinged out. And the more recent roll and write from them, or roll and reveal, depending on how, again, what label you want to use, Tend, which was currently funding at the time of me filming this, you expanded further into the Moonrakers universe as a push your luck dice rolling game here, comparatively to Tend, which is currently funding as more of a roll and write. It's still the roll aspect of things, offering you a standalone in that universe for 2 to 5 players with a little bit of mini expansion content for Moonrakers. It's another one of those press your luck match things, or you fail and you lose all of your progress as you're trying to match the dice that are rolled as well to the cards or the crew that you're going to be trying to achieve. Mission based, just like Moonrakers in the first place, having a little bit of risk assessment, push your luck, chaotic conduct, and awarding endgame prestige to see who did it the best. And actually, this is fulfilling at the time of me filming this. It is in the process of finishing fulfilling. So if you haven't heard anything or seen anything, well, you probably should have, and you need to send them a ticket. It only has 233 ratings, and it's sitting at a 7.5. So dice-based rolling, press your luck style of things, we'll see where it ends up comparatively. And is this really for you? I'd make the argument, or I'd make the question mark with this one. It raised over $600,000 on Backer Kit in the first place. Again, how much of that was Moonrakers adjacent as a game that people love, blinged out especially, versus just solely Moonrollers? So we'll have to just kind of wait and see as things roll in. I'm done. Can't top that. Peace out. Have a great freaking day. Let me know. Must-haves. And does looking back at these ones again, like I said at the beginning of the video, change your perception of some of the must-haves that are currently ongoing or have been really recent crowdfunding otherwise? Have a great day. Stay classy. Sub. You know what to do.